Hello! My name is Liz and this is Flexible Schedule Baking. I'm so glad that you can join me today to make some delicious chocolate chip cookies. There are a million different recipes for chocolate chip cookies. Some people have very strong opinions about what kind of fat base you should use, whether it should be butter or margarine or shortening. Some people think you should use more brown sugar versus white sugar. All of that to say, there are many different kinds of chocolate chip cookie recipes. This is my personal favorite. I use butter for almost everything that I bake except for chocolate chip cookies. Margarine, the structure of margarine is slightly different than butter, and it gives your cookie a little bit more height and a little bit more chewiness to it. When you use butter, they tend to have a little bit more crispness around the edge and a little bit more richness to them. Using margarine typically gives you a more chewy texture, which is what I prefer in a chocolate chip cookie. You can absolutely use butter in place of margarine if that's your preference. You can also use shortening. Again, it's going to change the texture and the richness of it, but you can make those adaptations as you like. So just really quick, let's go through the ingredients that we're going to need. We're going to need some margarine, 2 sticks. You're going to need some vanilla extract, baking powder, and baking soda, salt, all-purpose flour, granulated white sugar, and brown sugar, 2 eggs, and chocolate chip cookies. Now, I prefer to use the mini semi-sweet because I like the small chips that are easier to spread throughout the dough. You can use any kind of chocolate chip that you prefer. For baking, you're also going to need some kind of cookie sheet. I prefer to bake with stones because it disperses the heat more evenly. And I also prefer to use parchment paper instead of greasing a pan. Anytime you spray a baking sheet with oil, the texture on the bottom of whatever you're baking is going to change slightly. Usually it will become darker along the bottom and a little more crisp. I prefer to use parchment paper because then the bakedness of what I'm making is even on the top and the bottom. That's my personal preference. If you don't have parchment paper on hand, you can absolutely spray your pan or use a silicone baking mat. To start with, we're going to preheat our oven to 350. Now, this dough can be refrigerated. If you wanted to make the dough ahead of time, put it in your refrigerator and bake it later, absolutely, that's great. That will also give your cookie a little bit more structure. If you put the dough into the refrigerator for an hour or so, when you scoop it out onto the pan, your cookie is going to keep more of its height. When you bake it straight from mixing the dough and put it into the oven, they tend to flatten out a little bit more. So if you want your cookie to have a little more height, refrigerate your dough before you bake it. All right, so let's get started. We're gonna start by putting our margarine into a bowl, and we're going to cream this with our sugar. Now, it's very important when you are creaming your margarine or your butter in cookies that you don't over mix it. When you over cream your cookies, they have a tendency to spread out more. So it's really important to not over mix when we're making cookies. All right, so I have 2 sticks of margarine here, and then I'm gonna add in 1 cup of granulated sugar. This recipe, we're going to use twice as much white sugar as we do brown sugar. Some recipes call for equal amounts. Some recipes call for more brown sugar. However you vary those ingredients, the taste will be fine. The texture of your cookie will change depending on which kind of sugar you're using more of. I like this method. It gives my cookie a nice fluffy, chewy texture. If you use more brown sugar, you end up with a more almost brownie-like texture. All right, so I have my 2 sticks of margarine, 1 cup of granulated sugar, and I'm going to add half a cup of brown sugar. I prefer to use the light brown sugar. You can use dark. Just be aware it will change the color of your cookie a little bit and give it a little bit more of an earthy richness because of the extra molasses in there. All right, so I'm going to use my spoon and I'm just going to kind of smash this margarine in with the sugar so that I get a nice pasty consistency. We want to make sure that we don't have too many large chunks of margarine left in there without being mixed into the sugar, without over creaming this. You can obviously use a mixer if that's your preference. I find with this kind of dough though, it's easy to over mix when I use an electric mixer, so I prefer to mix by hand. Make sure you get all the way down to the bottom of your bowl so you don't have any hidden pockets of sugar or margarine. All right, so I have a nice pasty type consistency here. Now I'm going to add in my 2 eggs. Again, when you're baking with eggs, you want to make sure that you don't over mix. Over beating your eggs will cause your cookie to flatten out more. For those of you who need some tips on cracking eggs, I tap on the counter because when you tap on the bowl, sometimes you end up with a deep crack and you'll end up with an extra piece of shell, or your bowl might topple over if it's not a very stable bowl. So I always tap on the counter. I tap until I hear that crack sound, and then once I have a nice defined crack, I take both of my thumbs and stick them into that hole, push in, and then pull it open as if it's a book and allow the egg to fall out. By pulling it open to the sides, you're allowing the egg to fall out without taking the shell with it. All right, so I'm gonna mix those eggs in and get a nice pasty consistency here. Again, I'm not going to overmix, just enough so that the egg is nice and broken and dispersed within the butter mixture. Okay, just like that. I'm gonna rinse my hands really quickly, just so that I don't get egg everywhere as I'm handling my other ingredients. All right, so that's the base of our sugar mixture. So I'm gonna set that to the side, and now I'm gonna mix my powdered ingredients. You can do this with one bowl if you prefer not to use 2. The purpose of using 2 bowls when you're mixing something with wet and dry ingredients is to be able to add the powdered ingredients all together gradually. When you add things like flour, baking soda, baking powder into a wet mixture, once that dry component hits the wet, sometimes it will begin to clump. And so if you are adding things like baking soda into a wet mixture, you're more likely to end up with a clop of baking soda inside of a cookie, and you don't want that. So I like to mix all of my dry ingredients together, make sure they're thoroughly mixed and incorporated, and then gradually add them to my wet ingredients to prevent that clumping. All right, so now we're gonna do our flour. We're going to do 3 cups of flour. When you are scooping flour, it is very important to keep it nice and light and airy. If you compress and pack your flour into your measuring cup, you're going to have too much flour by weight. So you need to make sure that you're keeping the texture of your flour nice and light and airy as you're scooping. There are a few different methods to doing this, but my recommendation is to take whatever scoop you're using and then take a smaller one and fill it by sprinkling it into the scoop. This is called sifting. There are special contraptions you can buy for your kitchen that are flour sifters, and they will actually sprinkle the flour into your cup, but not very many homes have those on hand. So this is another way to do that. When you're scooping your flour, make sure that your measuring cup is nice and flat. There's not a mountain peeking over the edge. So I'm going to do 3 cups of flour, sifting into my measuring cup, to make sure that I'm not pressing down or packing my flour into the measuring cup. I'm going to give it a little shake, just like that. 2, and 1 more. Okay, 3 cups of flour. Now, I'm going to set this to the side. And remember, when you are baking, to always clean up your mess. Don't leave a mess for the adult in your home to have to clean up after you. If you are responsible for baking, you are also responsible for the mess. That means putting your ingredients away when you're finished, cleaning up your space, taking care of your dishes. All of those things are your responsibility if you are the one creating the masterpiece in the kitchen, okay? All right, so now I have my flour. To that, I'm going to add my baking soda, my baking powder, and my salt. Each of these I'm going to do half a teaspoon. I'm using 1/4 of a teaspoon, so I'm going to have to do 2 of each. But we want half a teaspoon of each thing. So half a teaspoon of baking powder. Baking powder is a combination of cream of tartar and baking soda. It gives a little bit extra lift and denseness to the cookie, whereas baking soda itself makes it very airy, almost like cake. So adding a little bit of baking powder gives it a little bit more chewiness than just cake-like texture. So half a teaspoon of each of these things: baking soda, baking powder, and salt. Okay? So those are all of my powdered ingredients. I'm going to use a whisk to make sure that all of those floured, powdery ingredients are mixed well together before I add them to the wet ingredients. Now you may have noticed that in the wet ingredients, there's one thing that I left out, and that was my vanilla extract. Vanilla extract is an alcohol base, and so it's important not to add vanilla too early on in your recipe, because as you stir it, that alcohol base will begin to evaporate, which means you're also losing some of your flavor. So by waiting to add the vanilla until later on into the recipe, we're keeping all of that flavor that we've added and not over stirring and causing it to leave. So what we're going to do is we're going to gradually add our flour mixture and our vanilla. So I have this fat base here. I'm going to pour in about half of this powder mixture. Doesn't have to be exact, just about half. And I'm going to start to stir that in. After I have this half mixed in, then I'm going to add my vanilla. And as always, if you have questions about this recipe or any of these ingredients or techniques, or maybe how you could substitute something that you don't have on hand, feel free to either comment in the classroom or send me a message. I check those regularly, and I'm happy to help any way I can. All right, so I have about half of that mixed in. I'm going to add my vanilla here. So we're going to add 2 teaspoons of vanilla. I'm going to open the seal. This is a very handy Anchor glass measuring cup. It has teaspoons and tablespoons on it, which is great for liquid. Anything where you're pouring it in and the lines are on the side is intended for liquid. Something where it's flat, such as an actual measuring spoon, this is more intended for powder-based things. Things that are more like a scoop or like a glass, or sometimes you might see the angled measuring cups. Those are intended for liquids. So 2 teaspoons of vanilla right into this batter. And I'm just going to give it a light stir until I feel like most of that is incorporated. I'm not over stirring my vanilla. All right, now I'm going to add the rest of that powder mixture. And just mix until incorporated and stop. Great. Make sure you're scraping the sides of your bowl, digging all the way down to the bottom, so we don't have any hidden pockets of flour. We don't want to scoop out a cookie and get a pocket of flour. All right. So we have a nice smooth texture here, just like that. All right, the final thing that we need are our chocolate chips. Now this is a matter of personal preference, whether you use 1 cup or 2 cups. Some people like a very chocolatey chocolate chip cookie. Some people like just a little hint. So 1 to 2 cups is my recommendation. I'm going to be doing 1.5 cups. Okay. And then again, I'm just stirring until incorporated and stopping so that I'm not over mixing my dough. Scrape all the way to the bottom to make sure those chocolate chips are dispersed all the way through. And just like that. Now, as I said before, if you didn't want to bake these right away, you can put them in a sealed container, either cover it with some foil, put a lid on it, stick it in your refrigerator. It also would freeze well. If you wanted to bake some and stick some in the freezer, just make sure that you thaw it before you stick it into the oven. What I'm going to do now is scoop onto my pan. Now, depending on the size of cookie that you want, you have a few options here. Option one, and my family's personal favorite, is to use an ice cream scoop and make a jumbo size cookie. Keep in mind that these will have to bake a little bit longer, more like 18 minutes in the oven. So for jumbo cookies, I'm going to use this ice cream scoop, and I'm going to scrape it along to make sure it's just flush with the top of the scoop and drop it down onto my pan. Keep in mind these will spread out, and so you need to make sure there's enough room on your pan if you're using a giant scoop like this. Okay? Just like that. Your other option is if you have a small cookie scoop, which is usually about half the size of this, that makes a standard size cookie. If you're wanting them to be all the same size, using a scoop is your best option. Another option is we can take 2 spoons, just like this, and scoop with one, and then we're going to use the bottom or the back of the spoon to push that dough off onto the pan, just like that. By using the bottom of the spoon to push it off, we're able to get more fully into the well of the spoon and get all of the dough out. So just like that, scooting it off. Okay, this works really well for any cookie dough that's very sticky, too sticky to roll into a ball with your bare hands. Okay, and just like that. These are going to go into the oven. If I'm doing standard size cookies, I'm going to bake these for about 10 to 12 minutes depending on your oven, sometimes closer to 14. You want them to be starting to create little cracks and air bubbles and have a slight matte finish, a flat finish where they don't look glossy anymore on the top, and maybe just slightly golden around the edge of the cookie. We don't want them to be fully golden across the top of the cookie or they're going to become hard. We want this to be a nice, soft, chewy texture. So not underbaked, but not fully golden. For a larger cookie like this, you're looking at probably 16 to 18 minutes to make sure that they're fully baked. Again, beginning to have small cracks and some nice air hole bubbles, as well as slightly golden around the edge and a nice flat matte finish, no longer shiny and glossy. Okay? Remember to put away all of your ingredients, wipe down your counter, take care of your dishes, and keep track of the oven with a timer so that you don't overbake your goods. If you have questions about this recipe, feel free to send me a message or drop a note in the classroom. Thanks and enjoy your cookies!